What is up, health enthusiasts? It's Coach Lamby here for Working Weights LLC, your guide to strength, health, and all things nutrition. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dwayne Ulrich, aka Poppy Dwirl.
What's up?
So today we are talking about artificial food colors and neurobehavioral impacts in children, the abridged version.
Abridged version. That's right.
All right. Dwayne, so this is kind of week 2 for us here. And for the listeners and the viewers out here, this is the abridged version. So we recorded an episode last week that is 2.5 hours long. It took us nearly 3 weeks of research. And we put a lot of time and effort into that. So it's long, and I understand that a lot of people aren't going to listen to the whole thing and watch that. So we are creating the abridged version today.
Gosh, if you guys just go back to that big long podcast and just try to find the mind map, it's like a map of the stars.
I'm going to show it today. I'm going to show both.
Are you going to show it? It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So
it covers everything.
To give people an idea. And if you're listening to this, I highly recommend you go over to YouTube. The link should be in the show notes. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or BuzzFeed or whatever, go to YouTube so that you can see this thing. And we put a lot of effort into this. This is not something that we haphazardly just did. We are both pretty interested in this topic, even though we're 2 weeks in. We're both still like on divergent rabbit trails, and so we're going to continue talking about this. Now, the long episode is going to come out next week. So the abridged version is going to come out first, and the long episode will come out next week. I highly recommend everybody listen to that because, of course, when we shorten everything, there's going to be missing context. There's going to be missing details. But I do feel that a lot of that is necessary for you to draw your own conclusions. So let's get into this thing, shall we?
Let's do it.
Mind node.
See, that looks like a starship, an Imperial destroyer on the side.
Yeah. So on the right-hand side here are all of the notes in the 2.5 hour episode. And on the left here are the abridged version. And this seems like it's long. It looks like it's going to be like, if this is 2.5 hours, this looks like it's definitely going to be an hour, but everything is summarized. So I think that it should look we should be able to get this done. Okay. So to start out, the way this topic came up was I've seen on my social medias across different platforms, different people have been sharing this internet article here. This one from Berkeley Public Health. A new report shows artificial food coloring causes hyperactivity in some kids, and it's a very short article, but the first paragraph here says basically that this new report confirms the belief that the consumption of food dyes, synthetic food dyes, causes hyperactivity and other neurobehavioral issues for some children. And I just realized as I was recording the other podcast, I was saying neurobehavioral.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Is that like nuclear?
Nuclear.
It's nuclear. It's nuclear.
So
that's funny.
One of those things. Neurobehavioral.
Oh my gosh, bro.
All right. So that news article, is saying that this report is showing, it basically confirms, right, that artificial food colors cause hyperactivity, and it has the link in there. So what that report is this assessment by the OEHHA. I would have to zoom in there. I think it's the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment or Associate or something like that. And so this document is a risk assessment report. Oh, there it is. Published by the California Office of Environmental Hazard Health Assessment, and it was done in 2021. The purpose of this is to review the scientific literature and conduct a risk assessment of the potential impacts of synthetic food dyes on children's health, particularly focusing on whether artificial food colors are associated with hyperactivity or other behavioral changes. So Let me switch over to that thing right quickly here. And so what we did is I read this report, and they name out 6 studies there. So they found 6 studies. So one of the complaints is like all of the studies were very old. It wasn't updated, blah, 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 blah. And so they found 6 studies in the past 10 years, and they thought that added some excellent weight to the current literature. And so what we did is went through those 6 studies. Yeah. All right. So in the discussion here, so this is directly interacting with the Berkeley News article, right? So they say, overall, we found a wide disparity in results in the studies we identified, although majority of studies reported at least some evidence of an association. And so I think that sentence in and of itself disproves the fact that this report found a cause, that artificial food coloring causes, because they found a wide disparity in the results. And the majority of the studies, which means some studies didn't find any association, right?
Right.
And then they're saying that they found a majority of studies report at least some evidence, which means many of those, the association is very, very small. So to come away with that as saying, oh yeah, this definitively proves that artificial food colorings cause hyperactivity, I think is misleading. And then, all of these highlighted in purple are the studies we looked at. We can come down here to the conclusion here, right? And they say, in summary, although the findings in the studies we reviewed are not entirely consistent from one study to the next, current literature provides a substantial amount of evidence. Consumption of synthetic food dyes is associated with adverse neurobehaviors. Yeah, outcomes in children. I don't know why I say that.
I don't know, bro.
All right. And then the thing that I kind of took the biggest issue with in this assessment is this sentence right here. However, after extensive analysis, we were unable to identify any clear set of biases or other factors that invalidated the positive associations reported in the current literature. And we do a lot of reviewing of scientific literature on this podcast. And I just thought when I read that, I thought to myself, wow, these things must be like quite concrete. If you didn't find any other reason, there is no plausible other explanation that could explain the results of these studies. They have to be solid. They have to be concrete, right? So we're going to go through all this stuff. All right. So going through this.
By the way, that sentence is a backhanded way of saying, it's like you say, the sky is falling. Well, all of our studies can't disprove it, so the sky must be falling. Oh my gosh, please.
Yeah. So in here, I mean, you guys saw as I scrolled through there, they have a bunch of stuff. They reviewed epidemiological studies and RC on the neurological effects of food dyes in children. They looked at animal toxicology studies on neurobehavioral toxicity of artificial food colorings, in vitro, which means petri dish studies of the mechanisms of action. They estimated exposure to food dyes. They conducted risk characterization, comparing exposure to toxicity thresholds. And they looked at a bunch of stuff in there. I mean, there's a buttload of research within this document. This document provides a comprehensive review and synthesis of multiple lines of evidence regarding potential impacts of food coloring on children's behavior and neurological risks. They specifically named those 6 studies, and you guys saw that I highlighted that. They were performed in the past decade, looking at artificial food colors and behaviors that are presumed to be higher quality and stronger evidence. And they concluded, after extensive review, they couldn't find any reason in the methodology or bias that could be producing positives. And I highlighted this because I take issue with that, and I come back to this many times on that longer podcast. And I'm probably going to come back to it many times today. All right, so let's go down. So one of these studies, the first one we looked at, Nig et al., is this meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis, for those of you who don't know, is a study of studies. So what we want to do, because not all studies are going to have the same results, we take a bunch of studies on a topic, we put them together, and we kind of find what's the average effect, right? So some of them are going to find more of effect, and some of them are going to find less of effect. Some of them are going to find a decrease. We want to know what the average is. That's what a meta-analysis does.
Right.
All right. And so this one investigates the relationship between ADHD and dietary factors, specifically artificial food colorings. There were 53 human studies that were included, spanning from 1976 to 2011. They analyzed the evidence from these studies to generate summary effect sizes, quantifying the impact of food coloring on ADHD symptoms. And the results suggest that parent reports, but not teacher or observers, indicate an effect of artificial food coloring consumption and increase in ADHD symptoms. And that's kind of important as to remember as we go through these things. They suggest that elimination diets may provide a clinically meaningful benefit for about 33% of children diagnosed with ADHD. And what that means is that about 70% of children diagnosed with ADHD will not find clinically meaningful results from an elimination diet.
That's right. That's right.
Around 8% of children with ADHD may have allergic type reaction, which, like seems plausible. I mean,
Yeah.
there are tons of people who are allergic to all kinds of weird stuff, right?
Right.
There was a significantly high degree of heterogeneity and publication bias. So what that means is that when we combine studies, what we're trying to do is find an average effect. And so I liken this to finding the average weight of an apple. If I want to know the average weight of an apple, what I want to do is gather a whole bunch of apples, right, and weigh the basket to find an average weight and individual weights of all of them to find an average weight. Now, if I include all apples, my sample is very homogeneous, meaning it's the same, right? Homo meaning the same, hetero meaning different.
Right.
If I start including things like different fruits, oranges, pears, bananas, and right, the heterogeneity of my sample is now increased. And the average weight that I get for these fruits is not going to give me a very good idea of the average weight of apples because the fruits are so different. Okay, so within this meta-analysis, the studies that they looked at were very different, and they're so much different that I actually find it to be quite inappropriate that they actually combine these for a meta-analysis. And there was a large degree of publication bias, and so publication bias means that when researchers will perform a experiment, they don't always end up getting results. A lot of times we get null results or no results, right? The result is zero. And they often don't publish that, right? It just doesn't get peer reviewed. They don't put it out in the literature because, it's not going to get headlines. It's not going to get notoriety or anything like that. So
it has no impact. There's no impact.
Yeah, it has no impact. And we really only see the things that people want to publish. It also means that when you do a meta-analysis, you have inclusion and exclusion criteria. Okay, so I'm only going to include studies that have this criteria, and I'm going to exclude the others. And so what that leaves us with is a selection bias. I have an extremely biased sample. Okay, and in the meta-analysis in this one, they did do a publication bias regression to see what the effect of publication bias would have on it, and actually lowered the effect sizes of these things. Important here, results are not reliable when looking at only FDA-approved artificial food colors, indicating all positive results are coming from outside the U.S.
That's true.
The authors concluded that overall the results are mixed and there needs to be more research. All right, so getting into our randomized control trials here, these are what they consider the higher quality evidence. So randomized control trials are considered to be the gold standard if you want to establish a causal effect, right? A cause and effect relationship between things, you do a randomized control trial. So this one here is Bateman, and this is a double-blind, crossover design, placebo-controlled, randomized control trial. And that has all of the mega buzzwords. Like if you really wanted to do a study to really accurately find a causal relationship, those are all the words that you would want to have included in there, okay? Main objective was to determine if artificial food coloring and benzoate preservatives influence hyperactive behavior in 277 3-year-old children from the general population of the Isle of Wight, UK. So right here we have confirmation that these results are coming from outside the United States, right?
Right.
They used a mixture of 4 artificial food colors, 2 of them are FDA approved and 2 of them are not FDA approved. Now, the problem with having mixtures is that we don't know if it is the combination of these colors that are causing it or if it's just one color that's causing it.
Right.
They also added this preservative in there, so we don't know if, you know what I mean? Like we can't pinpoint what's causing the effect here. So that is an issue. So going back to the OEHHA assessment, them after extensive review not being able to find a reason, okay, well, here's one reason, right? We don't know.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. So these children are randomized, and they randomize them through a random number generator. It's just a standard thing, right? You could go online, do a random number generator, and randomize people. So they received either an active challenge or a placebo first. So what this is a 4-week trial. The first week, the children were put on an elimination diet. They removed all artificial food colorings and preservatives and salicylates from their diet. Salicylates are found in certain plants. And they did that for 1 week. And then the children, so there's 2 arms. You either got the placebo first or the active challenge first. And that came in the form of a fruit juice drink. And then they did that for 1 week. And then the next week, they went back to that elimination diet. So they received 0 drinks. And then for the 4th week, they got the other one. So if you received the placebo first, the 4th week, you received the active. If you received the active challenge first, then the 4th week, you received the placebo. So the parents reported significant increases in hyperactivity, but not for impulsivity or inattention during the active challenge compared to the placebo. And this is an important thing to discover here within this paper, because one of the main concerns people have is that, well, we have this increase in hyperactivity, which leads to higher inattention and being more impulsive in these children. And so they'll suffer in the classroom. They're not going to be able to learn as well as the other children. They're going to fall behind. They're going to get held back. But in this trial, they found that those impulsivity and attention were not affected. It's just that the children were more hyperactive. Parents reported significant decreases in hyperactivity behavior during the elimination diet. And so this is the this is the graph here. Oh, come on, zoom in. That shows all this stuff. So we have 2 arms, 1 arm, 2 arm, and the peaks here are decreases. So on the left side here, you can see reduced hyperactivity and the arrow pointing up. So the higher up this goes, that means the more reduction in hyperactivity we have. And so starting out, they went on this week 1 avoidance diet, elimination diet. We can see that there was a reduction in hyperactivity. Then they received a placebo drink. We saw that there was an increase. They went on this elimination diet again, and we see reduction. And then at the active challenge, we see the increase in reporting. Now, I don't know if I have this later on. It's hard once I put all these notes together because there's so much information here. I can't remember all of it. So we're going to cover this right now. Come on. All right.
You're going to talk about the confidence levels, aren't you?
Yeah. So we have these boxes, which is called the point estimate. And then we have these little T bars sticking off the top and the bottom. Those T bars are what are called confidence intervals. And that tells us the range of reported effect here, right? So not everyone reported the same amount of hyperactivity. It would be in a range. Okay. And so that point estimate would be the mean, or lack of a better term, the average. The average and the mean are not the same thing, but this is for all intents and purposes the average, okay, would be right here, the point estimate. And then the confidence interval goes up and down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we have really, really big confidence intervals, that means that our confidence that this point estimate is actually where it should be, we have less confidence in that. When we have small arms like this, we can have relatively high degree of confidence that that point estimate is lying where it should be. It can possibly fall somewhere within these arms, so we have a high degree of certainty that it is where it's supposed to be. When the confidence intervals cross either the null line or the 0 line, sometimes this is reported as a 1, that means that finding is statistically not significant. So this purple line here is the null, okay, meaning this is baseline, all right? So before the children entered the trial, they were assessed on their hyperactive behaviors. That's what this line is. We see that for the elimination diet, that confidence interval here does not touch that 0 line, which means that that is a statistically significant effect. So when we hear the words, there was a significant decrease in hyperactivity, that's what that means. They're talking about statistical significance, not that the effect size was significant. All right. So we can see that for the elimination diets here, both of those are statistically significant. However, for both the placebo and the active challenge, they're not statistically significant, which in scientific terms, we would say there was no effect from placebo or the active challenge on children's behavior. Now, if you really want to get nitty gritty with this here, well, let me go to the second arm here. In the second arm, we can see that this active challenge here almost reached statistical significance. They don't provide us with the confidence intervals, the actual numbers, but this almost reached it. It's probably like there was a lot of reporting of confidence intervals, the bottom end being like 0.001, 0.003, which when it's that low
at all, it's like, why are we talking about it?
Yeah, like technically, I mean, I guess if you win a race, it doesn't matter if you win by an inch or a mile, right? But I mean, yeah. So what's interesting to me here is that, at least in this top arm here, and also this one here, we can see that between the placebo and the active challenge, the confidence intervals cross one another, which means the results from the placebo and the active challenge are not statistically significant from one another, which means there really is no difference. In scientific terms, there's no difference. Now, the point estimates are different, okay? Those are. However, they're statistically insignificant, meaning that we would say that there was no difference in effect between the two. But interesting up here is that we have half of the children in this arm, half the children in this arm. And in this arm, we can see that both the placebo and the active challenge, actually, the point estimate shows a reduction in hyperactivity compared to baseline, right? And it's only in this one arm, so only in half of the children here do we see actually an increase from baseline in hyperactivity. So this arm of the trial here is providing the full weight of what the authors are reporting here, the statistically significant increase. Okay, but we can see that even in this lower one here, the confidence interval for the placebo crosses that null association. So interesting stuff there. All right, so researchers found no significant differences in objectively measured behavior. So one of the things about this trial is they had parents reporting, and then they also took the parents to a psychiatrist, I believe, or a psychologist, and the psychologist put them through some validated tests, which include just observing them in free play, and then some different games to assess things. And we can see here in this chart is when the psychologist is actually looking at the children, there's really no change in effect. The observer is, so someone other than the parent is not observing changes in children's behavior during these time periods. Difference in results between the active challenge and the placebo results in an effect size of 0.51, indicating the placebo accounts for half of the effect seen during the active challenge. And we can go right back up here to this chart, okay? And looking at these things, we see that this confidence interval comes right about there. And then, of course, for this one, most of this active challenge is within the confidence intervals of this placebo challenge. And so when you look at the numbers of those, you get an effect of 0.51, which is half. Okay. So if a parent reported an increase in hyperactive behavior, whether or not that effect is due to artificial food colorings or placebo is left up to a coin toss. That's what that means. All right. And so to give you an example here, so if you have a bag that's filled with 77 marbles, okay, so the effect sizes that they found here is for the active challenge was 0.77, and for the placebo was 0.38. So if you have a bag filled with 77 marbles, 39 of them will be red, and that indicates our artificial food colorings. 38 of them will be blue, and that represents our placebo. And so your chances of drawing a red marble would be about 50-50, right?
Yep. Read that next
paragraph. There
you go.
Well, hold on. I'm getting over here. Now, the chances get worse if you consider some part of the effect could be due to a combination of artificial food coloring and placebo. So we have artificial food coloring being the whole effect, or placebo being the whole effect, or it could be that there's a combination, right? So the artificial food coloring may have caused an increase, but the parent observed it as being worse than it is. So some part of placebo is in there, right? So now we actually have three explanations, possible explanations as to what the results could be for this specific study. And so as you start adding possible explanations, right? So our chance that the artificial food coloring was causing results was 50-50, but now we've added in this possible combination that it could be a combination of the two. Now the chance drops to 33.3%, right? So if we have three possible explanations, you have a 1 in 3 chance, or a 1/3 chance of pulling that red marble. Half the children experienced decreased hyperactive behavior compared to baseline. We just went over that. That's the top graph, right? So if one were to accept that artificial food colorings increase hyperactive behavior, then one must also accept that fruit juice increases hyperactive behavior to a similar degree based on the confidence intervals that were here. Current reports significant reductions in hyperactive behavior during the elimination diet periods, the avoidance diet, and the washout. And the peaks indicate the significant reductions in those hyperactive behaviors. And I showed those, the peaks. However, children were still on the elimination diet during the placebo challenge. The placebo challenge didn't have artificial food coloring or preservative in it. They were just adding fruit juice to the diet, right?
And
so
looky there.
All right. So they go on this avoidance diet. We remove artificial food colorings. They're now given a fruit drink, and we see reporting of increased behavior. They're still on the elimination diet.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So if you're going to accept that the food coloring causes increase, then you have to accept fruit juice does too.
Yep.
All right. So while this trial was double blind, neither the parents nor the researchers knew what the challenge was. So somebody had to give the parents the drinks. That person didn't know if they were giving a placebo or an active challenge. The parents didn't know whether they were receiving active or placebo, and the children didn't know whether they were receiving active or placebo. Okay. But parents nor their children were blind to receiving either drink or not, nor were they blind to being in a trial and the main objective of the trial. Okay. So even though they didn't know whether or not the drink had artificial food coloring, they weren't blind to the fact that they were in a trial looking at associations between food coloring and hyperactivity. And they weren't blind to the fact that either they were giving their children a drink or they weren't. So we have an issue with blinding happening in this trial. And we can see that when the parents gave their children a drink, right, we see an increase in behavior, whether or not that drink contained artificial food coloring.
Right. Go back up to the research. No, the next one down below that's done by the researchers who are objectively watching.
Oh, this one.
That one right there. Yeah, make that a little bit bigger. Now, who was doing the observing in these
so this was a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I forget.
Yes. So in all of that, throughout all of that, so the trained observer, avoidance diet, placebo, washout, active challenge, and the end is, and it's never, it's those are not, it just kills me. Those are not significant changes.
Yeah, there's zero change happening.
But when the parents were involved,
right. Yes, the discrepancy in reporting
and the non-blind
between these two. Yes, so the psychologist or the psychiatrist actually did not know whether, the children were receiving drinks or not. It just, the children came in each week to the psychiatrist's office and they gave them their specific test. They did their observations. They had no idea what arm or what part of the trial that the children were on. So when someone knows that the child is receiving the drink, we see reporting like this. When people have no idea whether or not the child is receiving something, we see reporting like this. All right. So placebo had 0 artificial food colorings or preservatives, and the effect from the placebo should be 0. If artificial food coloring is the thing causing the effect, then the effect in the placebo arm should be 0 because the children are on the elimination diet.
Right.
All right. So we have another study here, Locke et al. And this one don't have public access to. I'm still waiting on the authors to get back to me on whether or not they will let me have this study so that we can review it. But for now, we just have the abstract. So this is 130 children, 70 boys, 60 girls in Hong Kong. Again, not in the US. Mean age of 8.6. This is another crossover trial, and this time they used capsules for the 3 arms instead of a juice drink. And so they had 3 arms. One of them, the capsules contained food coloring only. One arm was sodium benzoate, the preservative only, and one arm was placebo only. And neither the food coloring or the preservative had a statistically significant effect compared to placebo. Now, in the OEHHA article, they say the results of the challenge are hard to interpret because they're compared to baseline. But in the abstract, you can read it. They compared it to placebo. They didn't compare it to the baseline. They compared it to placebo. And this is page 48 of that OEHHA article. So conclusions from the authors there: no significant associations between artificial food colorings and preservative on Chinese children behavior at age of 8 to 9. Going down, we have McCann et al., and this one is very similar to the one we just discussed, not Locke, but Bateman. So double-blind crossover, placebo-controlled, randomized. Main objective: study the effects of food coloring and the preservatives on the behavior in 153 3-year-olds and 144 8 to 9-year-olds in Southampton, UK. So again, outside the US. Now, these guys used the same mix that was in Bateman. So 2 of the food colors were approved by FDA, 2 were not. They also had, geez, with the balloons. They also had mix B, okay, which was, they added a couple of different colors in there. Still 4 food colorings, still 2 of them approved by the FDA, 2 of them were not. And mix B was specifically put into this trial because it was supposed to reflect the habitual intake of both the type and the quantity of artificial food colorings that the children in Southampton, UK would be consuming. So they mix B contained more milligrams of food coloring for the day that the children were consuming than did mix A. All right. And they also adjusted for age. So I think it was 20 milligrams in mix A. And so they, for the 3-year-olds, and so they multiplied that by like 1.25 or something for the 8, 9-year-olds to account for the amount of food that the children would be eating. So this one was 6 weeks long. Children were randomized to receive mix A, mix B, or the placebo. So week 0, children came in on their regular diet. Okay, so the children came in, they just didn't change anything. They had the parents report their hyperactive behaviors on these scales that they had. Week 1 was the elimination diet plus placebo. Now, the good thing about this trial is that for all 6 weeks, they were receiving the drink. Okay.
Right.
Rather than the other one where they received it or they didn't, all 6 weeks. So week 1 was an elimination diet plus the placebo. Week 2 is when they received either mix A, mix B, or the placebo, depending on what they were randomized to. Week 3 was an elimination diet with the placebo. Week 4 was a challenge. Week 5, elimination. And so week 1, week 3, and week 5 are what we call washout periods. So we're trying to wash out any effect the artificial food coloring might have on the next challenge. So if I give the child mix A, I want to give them a period of time for that artificial food coloring to come out of their system or be metabolized, so that when I give them mix B, my results from mix B aren't going to be confounded by the results from mix A. All right. And so week 6 was a challenge. Teacher and parent scores were combined in here, so we don't get to see the difference between the two. And they were combined, and they created what's called the Global Hyperactivity Aggregate Score. And so GHA scores for the 3-year-olds. The authors reported statistically significant adverse scores from mix A, but not B compared to placebo. And we'll zoom in here. However, they had to remove the confidence intervals from the placebo in order to get that result. So on the left side of the chart here, we see all 3 of these. You can see it down here on the bottom: mix A, mix B, and placebo. And we can see all 3 of them have their point estimates with the confidence intervals. In order for the authors to report a statistically significant difference from mix A to from mix A to placebo, they had to remove those confidence intervals, and that's highly inappropriate to do.
Totally.
You don't remove the confidence intervals from a challenge, from an intervention in your trial to to find a statistically significant association. And so I've put this red line across here, and we can see that the placebo confidence interval intersects the confidence intervals for both mix A and mix B. So we say that all three of these are not statistically significant from one another. I mean, there just isn't a difference. Scientifically, there's no difference in the effect between the three of these.
Right.
Mix A, Mix B, and placebo all resulted in decreased global hyperactivity scores compared to baseline. So let me just zoom right in here. All right, so 0, our null line, this would be baseline hyperactivity. We can see Mix A, Mix B, and the placebo are all, the point estimate is all below the null line. So for the vast majority of the 3 and 4-year-olds in this trial, we see reduced hyperactivity on when they were receiving artificial food coloring.
Yeah.
For the 8 and 9-year-olds, authors reported statistically significant adverse scores for mix B, but not mix A compared to placebo. And again, they had to remove those confidence intervals in order to get that result. And again, if we can see the confidence.
Removing placebo from the results, it's almost kind of like saying, okay, I'm going to use these numbers because they kind of prove my point.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's highly inappropriate to do in a trial like this. Yeah, so confidence interval for the placebo, we can see crosses the confidence intervals for both mix A and mix B. There's no statistically significant difference in those results. And then during weeks 1, 3, and 5, and whichever week the children were randomized that they received the placebo during the challenge week, right? So 2, 4, and 6 was a challenge week, and they received either mix A, mix B, or placebo. They were randomized to receiving that. So weeks 1, 3, and 5, washout periods plus the placebo, and whichever week they received the placebo as a challenge, the children, again, were all on the elimination diet plus the placebo, all right? And we see that the placebo has a statistically significant, the placebo has a statistically significant increase in hyperactivity from baseline. Now, so you can see it, all right? So baseline is here, and we see the placebo, and the confidence interval does not touch the baseline. It's statistically significant increase on the placebo, which is just fruit juice. All right. And again, in this trial, the placebo accounts for half the effect size of the active challenges in this trial. All right. We have
explain that, McCann. Explain that.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, that goes back to the OEHHA thing, right?
It does. It absolutely does.
So we have to keep going back to that. After extensive review, they found no possible other explanation. All right. So Stevenson et al. I don't know why this has moved. 2020. And this actually is a secondary analysis of this one we just talked about that had the 3-year-olds and the 8 and 9-year-olds. And what they did here is when the children went into that previous trial, they took cheek swabs so that they could test their genomes, right? So this Stevenson et al. Went back and looked at genomic profiles of these children and compared those to the results. And what they were specifically looking for were these single nucleotide polymorphisms. So SNPs, you may have heard of SNPs before. They're looking at the association between the artificial food coloring, the reported global hyperactive activity aggregate scores, and specific SNPs, specific polymorphisms. And what they did find is they did find significant associations between specific genes related to histamine metabolism and dopamine, or norepinephrine systems, and the global hyperaggregate scores. And this does give credence to the hypothesis that the effect of artificial food colorings is happening through an allergenic type reaction. So that 8% of children who may have an allergenic, right? This study does lend credence to that because they did find differences in certain polymorphisms. And it was specifically whether or not they contained a certain allele within that polymorphism. So fascinating stuff here. However, these results are based on the global hyperactive scores in the McCann and are still subject to the placebo effect. So we saw in the 8 and 9-year-olds and as well as in the 3-year-olds that the placebo didn't have zero effect. The placebo still had some effect. So when you're looking at these SNPs in relation to the reported hyperactivity outcome, that association is still subject to the placebo effect. All right.
Right. Absolutely.
They also found that there was no association for any polymorphism and the baseline diet for the 8 and 9-year-olds. And this is odd because mix B was specifically supposed to represent what the children were consuming in the broader population. This mix B was supposed to represent what the habitual diet was. And so there were associations found between these single specific polymorphisms and mix B for certain things, but there was no association at baseline, which is weird because at baseline, they would have been consuming the same artificial food coloring.
Exactly.
As in mix B. All right. And then last but not least, we have Arnold, and this is a review, and it covered a lot of the studies that we went over. It added some interesting tidbits, and all of that is on this side of the mind map. This will be available to you guys. And it included a few questions that were asked to the council during the FDA committee meeting of 2011. And Dwayne and I put ourselves in the position of the FDA committee and answered some of those questions. And it also included a few more studies to look at, which made this whole rabbit hole even deeper. I did end up finding this Feingold diet book, though, which was another interesting tidbit there. But it also introduced the concept of specific nutrient deficiencies and ADHD behaviors. And when I looked into that, supplementation of those specific nutrients improved ADHD symptoms without an elimination diet. So this included things like magnesium, iron, omega-3, fatty acids, and zinc, to name a few, right?
Yep.
And so that introduced a new hypothesis. So Dwayne and I separately came up with many of the same alternative hypotheses, right? So possible different explanations as to why we're getting the results in these trials other than artificial food coloring. One of these is nocebo by proxy, and many people have heard of placebo, which means if you believe that an intervention or a medication or something is going to lead to positive outcomes, that you are more likely to experience those positive outcomes than not. Nocebo would be the opposite of that. So if you believe that a certain intervention will lead to negative outcomes, if you believe that that's going to happen, you're more likely to experience nocebo or negative outcomes. Nocebo by proxy means that there is a proxy person who is in close contact or relation with the individual who is receiving the intervention. So the proxy is not receiving the intervention. But if the proxy believes that negative things will happen from the intervention that the subject is taking, the proxy can have an influence on the outcomes that happen from the subject. And we cite, I cite several studies confirming that this actually happens. Not only does it happen in mothers and children, so there's one where mothers and children were brought into a trial. Half of them were told that their children received a large bolus of sugar, and half of them were told that their children received a placebo, when in fact all children received a placebo. 0 children received sugar, but the mothers who were told that their children received a giant dose of sugar observed their children as having increased hyperactivity. There's also this happens with pet owners and their pets. So we looked at something on osteoarthritis in dogs, head shaking in horses, where the animals received placebo, and the pet owners, despite there not being a difference in the outcomes for the pets, the pet owners reported in positive changes in their animals, as well as did the veterinarians. So if the veterinarians thought that the animals were receiving a treatment, the veterinarians also experienced a placebo by proxy effect. And the placebo thing is just rampant throughout the literature. Like, it's super, super prominent in osteoarthritis for human beings, and specifically looking at like the knee. So I've seen trials where they bring people in and they'll randomize them. So one group will actually get the surgery and the other group gets a sham surgery. So one group, they go in, they actually like scrape away the junk in your knee and actually do something. And the other one, they just cut your knee open and do like some exploratory stuff. They don't actually fix anything. And the people who receive the sham surgery often report better outcomes more often than the people who receive the actual thing. And so there's like a meta-analysis done just on knee surgeries. And they reported that like 70% of the benefit from knee surgery is due to placebo.
Crazy. That's crazy stuff. especially like placebo by proxy and
Uh-huh.
nocebo by proxy. It's amazing the effect that people have on just what they project onto the subject. So
Yeah.
it's crazy. The
So another,
veterinarian was what blew my mind. I'm like, oh my
yeah,
gosh,
that's
dude,
wild.
seriously?
Yeah, yeah. And that's particularly wild because we saw it in the veterinarians, but the veterinarians knew that the animals were receiving a treatment. And then in Bateman, the children went to the psychologist, but the psychologist didn't know when they were receiving their treatment,
Right,
right? So,
right,
all right.
exactly.
So we also have this nutrient deficiency thing, right? So if being deficient in a specific nutrient for a child who is clinically diagnosed with ADHD produces these increase in ADHD symptoms, then you know, um, what did we say? Oh, the diet is a concept of displacement. So whatever I'm consuming now displaces whatever I could be consuming instead, right? So a diet that is high in artificial food colorings and artificial preservatives is necessarily going to be deficient in these specific nutrients. So what's to say that it's the that it's the artificial food colorings that are producing these increase in behaviors and it's not just a nutrient deficient diet, right?
Right, right.
We have survivorship bias. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as we get down here. And then I added this one. So last time we just came up with these three alternative hypotheses, but as I was going through this one, I added fruit juice could be confounding the results here because in Locke et al., they didn't use fruit juice. They used those capsules, right? And they didn't find any difference compared to placebo. Now we see in the other two trials that there's no reporting of, or that actually the authors report significant results, but you have to remove the confidence intervals. And so what we don't know, we don't have that full study from Locke, so we don't know that they're just using the confidence intervals appropriately. But we do
You
have
ever,
this possibility that fruit juice is confounding the results. All right. So some of the main issues in this amount of research that we looked at here. All right. So animal and petri dish studies don't have reliable translation to human outcomes. They're only reliable about 6 to 8% of the time. And in the other podcast episode, I included 2 reviews. They're on the other side of this mind map. And one of them specifically talks about animal studies and neurobehavioral effects and human outcomes. And the title is let me see, I can just go up here to it. Title right here, why do over 90% of behavioral neuroscience results fail to translate to humans, and what can we do to fix it? All right, so rodent and petri dish studies, while they can be good for certain things, they just don't translate very well to human outcomes. The OEHHA makes the claim they extensively reviewed the literature and couldn't find any reason for the results other than just that the artificial food colorings are causing these. And Dwayne and I are just 2 guys on the internet here. We found at least 4 different possible explanations, right?
yep.
There's a suggestion that the elimination diet reduces ADHD behaviors, and all the studies we looked at included a placebo during the elimination diet, and there are positive results for the placebo. So the elimination diet can't possibly explain the decreases if the placebo is part of the elimination diet.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
None of the studies are done in the US. The results from NIG et al. Meta-analysis show that when we confine the results to FDA-approved colors only, so that would be the studies that we looked at, two of the food colorings in each of these fruit juice things were FDA approved, and when we combine results to only FDA approved food colors, the results are inconsistent. They're unreliable. We have issues of blinding, and we have inconsistent results for the studies we looked at. One would have to conclude that right. So if you're going to accept on the basis of this evidence that artificial food colorings are causing hyperactive behaviors, you are also going to have to accept that the majority of 3 and 4-year-olds, artificial food colorings are beneficial for ADHD because we saw reductions in hyperactivity
Absolutely.
when the children were consuming them for the majority of the children. It was only
Absolutely.
that one arm of Bateman where we actually saw an increase. We would also have to accept that the habitual diet of Southampton, UK, which no doubt includes artificial food colorings, is beneficial for the ADHD symptoms in 8 and 9-year-olds. Because when we look at that McCann analysis and we look at the results from baseline, they're just about zero. And then you also have the genetic study that looked at the single nucleotide polymorphisms and found no association with those and baseline. And then we would also have to accept that fruit juice is just as much of a problem for 8 and 9-year-olds as is the challenges containing artificial food colorings. Placebo accounts for half the effect in all of these active challenges, at least half.
Yep.
All right. And the alternative hypotheses that we've put forth here have not been sufficiently answered with within any of the documents that we've looked at. When you start increasing the number of possible explanations or combinations of explanations, the odds of the effects that we're seeing, the results being due to artificial food colorings, decrease logarithmically. Okay. So we have produced, as of right now, for the studies that we have looked at so far, at least 4 possible alternative explanations. All right. And so that means that if you just think about there being 4, there's actually 5. So it could be artificial food coloring, and it could be one of these 4 alternative explanations that we come up with. So when you include just 5, that means that the chance, so if we have our bag of marbles, right, we have 5 different colors of marbles in there now, and we have 100 marbles in there, the chance that you draw that red marble is now reduced to 20%. When we start considering combinations, so if you remember, you could get marbles that had red and blue or blue and green. You start considering all the possible combinations, that leaves us with 31 possible explanations just for the alternative hypothesis we put forth here. And
Right.
that drops your chances of drawing that red marble down to 3.2%.
Yep.
So these are some issues, okay, with what's being reported out here on the internets and what people are using as evidence. And you have to be careful what you are willing to accept on the basis of what evidence, because as I just pointed out, if you're willing to accept on the basis of the evidence put forth here that artificial food colorings increase hyperactivity, you're going to have to accept they're beneficial for 3 and 4-year-olds. You're also going to have to accept that the baseline diet of the children of Southampton, UK is beneficial for ADHD symptoms, right? You're going to have to accept all of those things. So you need to be careful what you are accepting for
Right.
evidence and the basis
Right.
of these things.
Right.
And now we get to the last part here, which is one of my favorite things in the world, logical fallacies. And these are generally used by people on the internets, the interwebs, out there trying to make the case that artificial food colorings are the cause of so many things. So I've added a few since we did last time, so we'll run through these. Gish Gallop. So Gish Gallop is bombarding the opposition with a large volume of arguments, studies, and data points, some of which may be inaccurate or irrelevant, so that it becomes difficult or impossible for the other side to review or fact check everything in real time. This could potentially overwhelm and mislead the audience about the overall strength of evidence for either position. I deal with this all the time on the internet. Just a bombardment. People can't stay focused on one thing, right? So we have hasty generalization, which is drawing a broad conclusion about the effects of artificial food colorings on children, on all children, based on studies with a small, possibly non-representative sample size or limited set of conditions without sufficient evidence to substantiate applying the findings to a wider population or variety of scenarios. We have the appeal to quantity, which basically just is kind of like the Gish Gallop thing, but someone could look at any one of these things. So this is the OEHHA assessment. This is that Feingold diet book. And this is an article put out by the CSPI. It's titled A Rainbow of Risk, or like food coloring, a rainbow of risk or something. And all of these, the amount of evidence, the amount of studies that's cited within these things is just massive. So if somebody's offering these as a point of evidence, they are appealing to quantity. Most people are just saying, well, look at the number of studies within this thing. How could it possibly not be, right? And that's just an appeal to quantity. And that's not to say that the evidence within here is of low quality. It may be irrelevant to the topic, right? It could be included inappropriately, various reasons. We have the appeal to nature, which just as somebody says, hey, I trust natural food colors more than artificial food colors just because they're natural, right? Not because they have more safety data or more testing than the synthetic diet? Would it just because they're natural?
Yep.
Selection and survivorship bias. Now, this applies to research. So when we look at the meta-analysis, I talked about the selection bias that's due to a meta-analysis. You have inclusion and exclusion criteria, and what survives that ends up being an extremely biased sample, right? So we also have, when we consider, people often make the argument about the rates of ADHD diagnoses nowadays. And there's also a selection and survivorship bias that comes with that. All right. So when people make that argument, they often don't take into account, right? So they don't look at, where is it? The change in diagnostic criteria over time. They don't take into account that awareness has increased. They don't take into account that we have lower infant and child mortality than we did in the past, right? So the children who were dying in the past were presumably weaker and more susceptible to allergies and stuff like that. And now they're surviving. So we're just seeing the result of that rather than artificial food coloring are actually causing this thing. It's just that more children are surviving who would be more susceptible to it. And they also don't take into account people's willingness to seek out diagnoses. Moat and Bailey fallacy. This one is used quite a bit. So Moat and Bailey is someone will have two positions on a single subject. Bailey is the more extreme position. It's harder to defend. And the moat would be the less extreme position. It would be more generally accepted by people. Say, well, that's not too extreme. That could be plausible,
Right.
and it's easier to defend. So depending on who the person thinks their audience is. So if it's in like a private discussion board or something like that, people generally put out the Bailey, right? And they might say something like artificial food coloring is in everything and it's causing an epidemic of ADHD and we need a complete ban to protect our children's health. Now, if someone challenges that position sufficiently enough where the person has a hard time defending it. So someone might say, well, listen, my child doesn't have a problem with artificial food and they love those foods. So I don't understand why you're calling for a ban on this stuff when my child loved those food and I don't have, my kids don't have a problem with it. So the person will then retreat back to the moat, which is an easier position to defend. And they'll say, well, I never said that all children have issues and natural food colors still exist. So you could still have your child could still have their favorite foods. And they just don't have to have the artificial food colorings. And this is just, I'm not telling you this is what you have to do. This is just what my family practices. All right. So that's Moat and Bailey fallacy. Arguments from anecdote. And this is just people reporting their own individual experiences, without taking into account that you are not performing a scientific study. There are multiple reasons as to why you could be seeing the result that you're seeing. And your individual experience does not necessarily mean that it's representative of the broader population. All right. Now, my favorite here that we've gone through the whole episode, the invincible ignorance fallacy.
I love
Invincible ignorance refers to a state of willful ignorance in which a person refuses to consider evidence or arguments that contradict deeply held preconceptions, rendering the person effectively ignorant despite having the facts. We'll just move on from there. We have the come
This is
and
just
post.
rampant.
Yes, we'll have the come and post ergo propter hoc. Basically, what this means is because of this, therefore this. So X and Y happened at the same time, therefore X caused Y. And so dealing with what we're specifically talking about is increase in ADHD diagnoses have happened at the same rate. The increase of artificial food coloring consumption has happened. Therefore, artificial food coloring consumption increasing has caused this increase in ADHD diagnoses. Fallacy of a single cause, right? So people will oftentimes just, say artificial food colorings are the cause of this thing without considering that there are multiple factors in here. We've included a genetic study, right? So there's possible genetic polymorphisms that could explain some of this. So if you're saying artificial food colorings are the sole cause of it, that is the fallacy of the single cause. Now, somebody might say, okay, well, I've made those arguments and you're pointing out that it's a logical fallacy. I don't understand what the problem is with using a logical fallacy. So fallacious arguments can be deceiving to the audience and hiding flaws in reasoning. And the conclusions are not actually supported, even if a fallacious argument makes them sound reasonable. And a lot of fallacious arguments do make the conclusions sound reasonable. Fallacious fallacies introduce errors into discussions and decision making, and they divert focus from substantive points and evidence to flawed lines of thinking, like the appeal to nature.
They used to
Over
call this
time,
snake. They used to call these snake oil salesmen.
snake oil salesman, yeah.
Divert you from the facts.
Yes. Over time, reliance on fallacies can erode intellectual integrity and standards of evidence, and it promotes superficial thinking over vigor and validity. And this, I think, is a huge problem on the internet. People just will focus on superficial thinking. And something else that we talk is there's that saying we watched this in the Plant Choppers video where somebody will say, "Well, I don't understand how an old food or a food that we've been eating forever can be responsible for modern diseases." And it's like, well, it can. Audience may be misled into accepting claims that are not actually justified. This can have negative impacts if faulty ideas are acted upon. Using fallacy is disrespectful in discussion and debates as it circumvents honest engagement with alternative viewpoints and evidence. And once highlighted, fallacious arguments undermine the credibility and trustworthiness of the person or group using them, and it raises doubts about their commitment to rationally justified positions. So something that I highly recommend everybody do is when you hear someone put forth an argument, artificial food colorings are causing X, Y, and Z, or it could be anything, right? ChatGPT and Google Gemini are actually pretty good at telling you if there's a logical fallacy entailed within someone's claim. So you can just copy and paste it right in there and ask it, is there a logical fallacy in here? And they will tell you more often than not, about 95% of the time when I do that, when I take someone's post and I put it in there, number one, I already know that there is, but I just want to prove to them that it's in there. And so I'll put it in there. Hey, what logical fallacy is entailed from this? And it'll spit out the logical fallacy. So there we go, man. I don't know how long this took. Probably longer than anticipated.
Just about almost an hour and 20 or hour and 15 minutes.
Mm.
So one of the things that we just talked about the last arguments, and I was just thinking about this. So many people, and what I see especially on the internet, but even in casual conversation, if you engage somebody about some of these topics. So if my favorite person is Coach Lamby, and I trust him completely because I just like him. He's my kind of guy. We used to hang out, or that's my guy. So, and I just tell somebody, you know what, color dyes in foods causes hyperactivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say that because Coach Lamby says it, because that's my guy and that's who I like.
Yeah.
And then people will argue with me. I'm saying, well, you're crazy, because Coach Lamby did all the study. I saw it. I was there, and it's true. And then the next person might go, well, Dwayne's buddy, Coach Lamby, he studied all that. He knows and then at some point in there, people don't want to admit their ignorance. First of all, they don't want to do the study themselves. The second point, they want to admit that, oh, I haven't done the study, but because I know, a friend of my friend, did all the study, and he says, do you see where that's at? And that is so rampant on especially on the internet. It's just,
studies show, yes. And
what studies?
you do see a lot. People will point to some influencer or expert that they say, and they'll put something out on social media, and they'll say, wow, this is really fascinating stuff, and it's backed by research. Is it crappy research?
Yeah.
Is that person citing that research accurately? You know how many times I've looked into something where somebody cited a research paper and the research paper said the opposite of what that person was saying it said?
Yes, we've even talked about some of those things.
Yeah, right in the abstract. Right in here, for instance, the OEHHA reported that the Locke et al., so that one on the Chinese children, said it was hard to interpret the results because they were comparing the challenges to the baseline. When you could read it right from the abstract, they compared it to placebo.
Right, exactly. Another thing is, Coach Lamby and I were talking about this right before we got started. And so we were talking about this right before we got started. So I'm doing some research on another facet, another arm of the food coloring thing. And I was reading several articles that were, they're notable. They seem to be legit, but at some point in there, it's actually because they're selling a product or they're providing a service. And they say, well, studies show, blah, 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 blah. and all the testing and so shows blah 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 blah, but they never cite the study. They never cite the study until the end, and then they say, contact us for our, what we can do for you or our product, but they never cite the study. They just say studies show.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So hopefully hopefully I can cut this down more because I really wanted to be under 30 minutes. I don't know how. It's just the amount of stuff that we looked at is just so massive. It's hard to
Well, I've already
condense all that
identified a
down.
good 30-second spot in there about the juices. We can cut that out right there. That'll take 30 seconds off of it right there, dude. 30
yeah.
seconds.
So
It's
yeah.
massive. It's a massive subject.
It's
We could
huge.
still do
And
another week or two on this.
yeah, and I want to, I'm still not so as it stands, what we've currently read so far, I don't find the evidence here to be highly convincing. Right? Our answers are not answered. Our questions, rather, our alternative hypotheses have not been answered sufficiently for me to be convinced that artificial food colorings are causing the hyperactive behaviors, these neurobehavioral issues in children. So yeah, so I find the evidence here less than convincing. I'm not beyond the point of being convinced, and we're both continuing to read on this, and I think that we will have 2 or 3 more podcasts on this topic. So Dwayne's looking into autism. I'm looking at the FDA committee meeting that happened in 2011, where they reviewed all this stuff and they came out with their consensus statement. So I'm looking into that. So, I don't think either of us are beyond the willingness to be convinced and looking at further data.
Agreed.
Neither of us are what's the word? Promoting the consumption of artificial food coloring, right? So that's not what we're saying here today. We're not saying artificial food colors are healthy and that you should be consuming them. Just saying I don't find the evidence that they are the cause of hyperactivity to be quite convincing.
Right.
As put forth here today. And not to say that there aren't people out there who have specific allergies to them. Yeah, I think that that's more likely than not, right? That someone out there has an actual allergy and actually sees some type of allergic reaction when they consume this stuff. And so for those people, you know what I mean? It's just like for pickles and shellfish, you don't eat the stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that we need a ban on, I said pickles, peanuts. That doesn't mean we need a ban on peanuts and shellfish just because some people are allergic to it. So there you have it. All right. Hope minds are blown. I hope this answers some question. I hope this gives some people some ammunition to be armed with when you go online and you start seeing a lot of this stuff being posted by influencers and whatnot. And so now you have some information to arm yourself with and combat the nonsense that happens out there.
That's right.
And I hope you guys listen to the full breakdown of all of these studies. There's a whole bunch of detail in there that we didn't cover today. And yeah, we will see you guys next time. Lamby and Dwayne out.
See you later, guys.